If God does not exist, then those who believe in Him are holding on to an imaginary friend, just like a child who never grew up. And I think you know, those of you who profess the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that many people who know you, many people in the world look at us in just that way. We're just like intellectual children. We just haven't grown up, and we're holding on to this invisible friend that we need so desperately. A couple of years ago, I debated an atheist lawyer at the University of California, Davis. We had a very nice audience that evening. About 1,100 students came out. And one of the points that this lawyer wanted to make against me and against all those who are like me is that we have an invisible friend. We can't adduce any kind of evidence that God exists, and so we're holding on to illusions. And so he challenged God to show himself that night. It always makes me wonder what's wrong with atheists when they do this sort of thing. But what he said is, so God, show yourself. If you exist, come into the auditorium tonight. Boy, that's a rash and an arrogant thing to say, isn't it? Of course, he didn't understand that, and so when I responded to him, I said, you should be very glad that God in His grace did not take you up on your offer. Because if He did, He wouldn't be coming to prove things to you. He'd be coming to judge you. But nevertheless, those who don't believe in the judgment of God, who are not willing to acknowledge His existence, they think we're the ones that hold to an illusion. On the other hand, if God does exist, I think atheists are really like the child who denies his own parents' existence. The child who gets angry and says, I don't have a father. So I suggested that to Mr. Tavish the night I was debating with him. One of the reasons he didn't believe in God, he said in this debate, is that the doctrine of hell is abhorrent to him. The idea that God would send people, and he gets very sarcastic, to the barbecue pit, as he put it, for not praying to Jesus, he found just intellectually and morally abhorrent. And so he simply would not believe in God. And I replied in the debate to that the issue of whether God exists or not has nothing to do with whether we like it. And that kind of reasoning, if you can call it reasoning at all, is like the child who says, I don't like broccoli, so broccoli doesn't exist. Or the child who pulls the covers up over his head and just will not acknowledge his parents being there because he's so angry at his parents. But you see, one way or another, somebody's being an intellectual child here. One way or another, the existence of God points to the greatest of all illusions. Believers in God may be the deluded ones, or disbelievers in God may be the deluded one, but we can't both be right. Somebody's living in a world of fantasy. Indeed, somebody is living in a world of insanity, intellectually speaking. Now, you know very well that I wouldn't be here this morning, and if you heard me last night, you know that I believe that the existence of God is objectively true, and I believe it's provable. Last night, we said that the task of apologetics falls to all of God's children. All of us are called upon to be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks a reason for the hope that is in us. All of us need to engage in argumentation. So often in the Christian church, we're not prepared to handle the truth. We don't want to deal with issues of truth. And often we don't want to deal with issues of argumentation. That's uncomfortable. It's also kind of a burdensome task. We got to think hard. We got to work hard if we're going to do that sort of thing. And many Christians are simply not willing to do it. But it is what God calls us to do. If we'd be obedient to what Peter tells us in 1 Peter 3:15, we need to be prepared to argue. And I said in my first lecture last night that we need to show who's really in the dock. God is not in the dock, intellectually speaking. When all is said and done, the unbeliever is the one who stands in the dock, who stands before the bench of God's judgment. And our apologetic must function to bring that out. I'm going to try to show you how to do that this morning. And in the second lecture, I gave kind of a mediating step along the way when I said the way in which you're going to be able to handle any argument, any objection that's brought up by people, and put the unbeliever in the dock intellectually, is to focus on this issue of worldviews. Everybody's got a network of fundamental assumptions or presuppositions about the nature of reality and how we know what we know and how we should live our lives. Everybody's got a worldview. Not everybody knows the vocabulary. Not everybody would be able to tell you straight out in an articulate way what their worldview is. But everyone works within a worldview, a philosophy of life. Everyone has a faith commitment, a religious commitment to a particular way of seeing the world in which we live, and man's place in the world, and whether God exists, and how we know the things that we do, and how we should live the lives that we live. Everybody's got a worldview. And these worldviews need to be brought into contrast with one another. We need to point out to the unbeliever, this is the way you are reasoning, these are the assumptions you have, and these are the assumptions that I have. These worldviews, in principle, contradict each other at every point. And if the unbeliever were completely consistent with his philosophy of life, and the believer completely consistent with his philosophy of life, we really couldn't talk to one another. We wouldn't have any foundation for an understanding of how we live, how we argue, what's real. But that isn't what takes place. There is a foundation for talking with one another because I said last night, unbelievers are cooking the books intellectually. They say one thing about their worldview, they proclaim one thing, and yet in their heart of hearts, they know something altogether different because God has shown it to them. And as Paul said, they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And because they suppress the truth, because they cook the books intellectually, Paul says their thinking is reduced to absurdity, to futility. Professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. And this morning, that is our lesson. I'd like to show you that the existence of God is objectively provable because those who reject the existence of God are reduced to intellectual foolishness. So you have some idea of where we're going. The question of the truth of God's existence has nothing to do with the psychology or the character of those who argue one way or another. When you get involved in apologetical discussion with the unbeliever, do not allow yourself to be drug into a discussion of what your motives are, and don't you bother to deal with the motives of the unbeliever or the character of the unbeliever. Later you can bring that up, but in terms of the argument as it starts out, we simply have to say we're interested in what the objective truth is. Let me give you an example. Imagine that I learned algebra from somebody who was later proven to be a child molester. Now what I want to know is, should I then throw out everything that I was taught about algebra because of the character, the very evil and wicked character of this person who was my teacher? I think we all know the answer to that question. Algebra is algebra is algebra, regardless of what a man does in his free time, right? Or if Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone out of an insane hatred of his postman father, I don't think any of us would say, well, we can't use telephones, because after all, the motives of the man who invented the telephone are suspect. Or what if Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone out of sordid greed? He just wanted to get rich and he was selfish and so forth. Would we say, okay, well that shows that his discovery is completely wrong? I'm bringing up these analogies. Some of you are smiling already because you've heard people say that about Christians, right? Well, those people on the television, they just want to get money. And I say, okay, but is what they're saying true? You see, the motive of the individual has nothing to do with the truth of his message. Or it'll be pointed out, and it is, of course, a tragedy that we have to answer for these sorts of things. They are embarrassing. But it'll be pointed out that there have been well-known religious leaders that have been caught in sexual scandal or whatever it may be. People say, see, there you have it. And I say, well, what do you see? You see a hypocrite, right? You see a man who doesn't live up to what he preached. In the world, do we find that unbelievers are paragons of virtue? They're always consistent with everything they say. We don't see any kind of hypocrisy among unbelievers. If hypocrisy discounted what was being said, no one would be talking. The question of the truth of God's existence has nothing to do with the psychology or the character of those who believe and argue one way or another. Sometimes we are told, I ran into this in graduate school so often it became humorous. We're told that Christians believe in God because it's a psychological crutch for them. They need God. They're weak people. So they lean on God. When people would tell me that, I'd say, so? And how does that show that he doesn't exist? Because you see, if the Christian God exists, he made us to lean on him. He made us with this craving inside. As Augustine once said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And so the fact that I am dependent upon God psychologically has nothing to do with whether he exists or not. We could just as easily point to the fact that Christianity is not the type of religion people would make up if they were going to make up a religion. I mean, if we're going to go about devising, this invisible friend out there that we're going to lean on psychologically, guess what? We wouldn't make an altogether holy friend who can see right through us and judge our motives. Isn't that right? We want our friends, and we may feel a little more comfortable with our friends, we don't want people to see us inside and out for what we really are, and to judge us to the nth degree of accuracy in terms of what righteousness and justice and love and honesty demand. We wouldn't make a God like that. If I were going to make up a God, I really think it'd be a lot closer to Santa Claus. Because Santa Claus is really kind of he's a kindly old man, but he's pretty stupid. Isn't he? Santa Claus says he knows whether you're naughty or nice. I had yet to hear any child say, all my naughtiness caught up with me this Christmas. Santa Claus always gives the presents, no matter what. You see, that's just kind of a fake threat out there about if you're naughty, you're not going to get toys at Christmas. You get toys anyway, right? That's the kind of God I'd make up if I were going to be making up a God. And so all this Freudian nonsense about, you have these psychological needs and so forth, that's utterly irrelevant to the argument. People will say that if you're a theist, if you believe that God exists, that will distract from a pleasurable life in this world. They'll tell you that theism is just a political ploy of those who want to dominate our lives and take away our independence. It's really an agency for oppressing minorities or oppressing the poor or, worse, oppressing women or whatever it may be. Atheism has all these horrible things attached to it. In every single case, you need to remember, though, that these arguments are what we call reversible in logic. It's just as easy to turn the argument around and direct it against the atheist as it is to let the atheist direct it against us. This kind of argumentation is subjective, and it's equally subjective one way or another. It's a two-edged sword. It cuts both ways. It's reversible. And so let me reverse the argument for a moment here. We can play this game too. I'd say that you're an atheist, Mr. Jones, because your atheism originates in fear and in wishful thinking. It originates in fear of judgment, and so you'd rather say there is no God than face up to your sin and your guilt. I'd say that your atheism originates in wishful thinking because you want to pretend that you're independent. You can get along all by yourself. You're self-sufficient, but you're not at all self-sufficient, either physically, biologically, economically, intellectually, psychologically, and yet we all play this game that we're independent. Maybe Freud had a bad relationship with his biological father, and so he sublimated his hate against his heavenly father, took it out on God. You can play that game. And atheism really prevents enjoying life to the fullest. Look at the angst and the fear that atheists have to put up with, the misery and the confusion and the dissipation of their lives. And if you want to talk about justifying oppression and statism, atheism has been in history the leading oppressor of minorities. You want to look at oppressive regimes, look at communism. Consider the French Revolution. So you see, this kind of back and forth about the psychology and character of those who believe or don't believe in God is, in the end, philosophically irrelevant. For every snide reference made to the Inquisition, the theist can match it with a snide reference to the French Revolution or to Cambodia. For every snide reference by the atheist to the puritanical strictures or the witch trials, the theist can match it with a reference to the gulags and to Marquis de Sade. For every snide reference to the hypocrisy of a Jim Baker or a Jimmy Swaggart, the theist can match it with a reference to the debauchery and the arrogance and the utter hypocrisy of atheist intellectuals like Shelley and Byron and Marx and Hemingway and Russell and Sartre. And so we're getting nowhere when we talk this way. Let's get back to the point. Is the existence of God objectively true? And my argument is going to be it is objectively true and provable. I don't mean to say that the argument I'm going to offer you this morning will necessarily convince. In fact, I'm not even going to make an attempt to convince those who refuse to believe in God, because that would hamper their desires or make them unhappy. If the existence of God is going to make somebody unhappy, I'm not going to pretend that the existence of God would make them happy. They refuse to believe for that reason. They refuse to believe. But you see, my having diabetes doesn't make me happy. It's a real inconvenience. When I had this discovered a few years ago, I argued with the doctor about it. But you see, my arguments were not based upon my scientific and superior insight over against the doctor's lab results. My arguments were based on what? I don't want it to be true. But I had diabetes, whether I want to believe it or not. And God exists whether atheists wish to believe it or not. I'm not going to deal with all the psychological nonsense that goes on inside them that leads them to say, oh, no, I'm not convinced. Because proof is not the same as persuasion. That's something we need to get real clear about. An argument need not be accepted by everyone in order for it to be a conclusive argument. Proof and persuasion are two different things. If the doctor had not persuaded me that I had diabetes, that would not mean that he did not prove that I had diabetes. Okay? And people can be persuaded of things for which there is no proof. Last time I looked, there are still people who think Elvis is alive. And they're utterly persuaded. And every, doctored picture that we see in the tabloids is just one more piece of evidence to support that idea. But that isn't proof. People are persuaded of things that are not proven, and people are not persuaded of things that are. That's a terrible thing about human nature. That in itself, this is an aside, that in itself is worthy of discussion with the unbeliever. How does it come about, given your worldview, that people have this ability? If people really were just advanced animals adjusting to their environment, does delusion help us adjust to our environment? How does that help the biological process? How does it come about that people can do that? Why can we, to use the words of Sartre, negate being? Reality is a certain way. How is it that we have the ability to think contrary to the way things are? I mean, in the atheistic evolutionary account of man, it's really difficult to understand how people think at all and have self-consciousness, much less how they have false consciousness. Where does that come from? How is that possible? Well, it is possible. It happens all the time, and I only bring it up here to make the point that the argument I'm going to give you this morning will prove the existence of God, even if the atheist is unwilling to cry uncle. Okay, so let's make a few fundamental points. First, about what exists and how we know it exists. There's a difference between something existing and our having a theory or a proof about it existing. We've already made this point many times. To repeat it, something can exist without a person knowing that it exists. I might have cancer and not know that I have cancer. And something can exist without a person being able to prove it, although I'm going to show that God can be proven. And something can exist even though a person offers reasons against it. I did that. I said, I don't have diabetes. Here are my reasons. But I had diabetes. So let's get very clear about that. The existence of God is different from what people do in terms of proof, or what they would say, or what they claim to know about the existence of God. And then maybe a few words about faith and reason. Sadly, one of the biggest downfalls in the Christian church, one of the greatest pits we fall into when it gets to taking the message of the gospel to the world, is the idea that we rest on faith, and that means we turn off our intellect. The mistaken and I think very misleading idea is to think that faith takes over when reason turns off. in which case faith is something other than reason. Reason takes us so far, and then you've got to make this leap of faith, as we say. And that leap of faith taking over at the edge of reason indicates that faith is not reasonable. When you come to faith, you're not using reason. I don't believe that for a moment. In a radio dialogue that I had with George Smith, who was, before he died, a leading advocate of atheism, had written a book, The Case for Atheism, The Case Against God. I noted that in his book, he had this conception of faith. He said that's the problem with faith. People who believe in God are renouncing reason and taking this leap of faith. And so they think reason goes so far and then faith takes over. And I said, George, you've got it completely wrong. I said, that's not my conception of the relationship of faith and reason. I think that faith is the foundation for all reasoning. That the reasoning we engage in cannot be made reasonable without the foundation of faith in God. He was utterly flabbergasted by that. He said, well, then what you're saying is that people who engage in reasoning believe in God. I said, that's right. I'm glad you got the point. But he was scandalized by that. He said, I don't believe in God. And I said, well, I think you do. And the evidence is that you continue to engage in reasoning, and it's unreasonable to engage in that kind of reasoning unless you have a foundation of faith in God. That's going to be my proof in just a few moments. I'll illustrate that for you, but at least you know where we're going. Faith and reason, how are they related? Faith is the foundation for the exercise of man's intellect. And if you take that foundation away, this is my point, unbelievers are cooking the books, they don't admit this, but you take that foundation away, and reason is no longer reasonable. Science is no longer scientific. Logic is no longer logical. Morality is no longer moral. To make a point that probably has to be conceded here for many Christians, or indicated for you, the fact that I'm affirming reason now, man's intellectual capability, shouldn't lead you to think that I'm endorsing what's called rationalism. The idea that man's mind is the highest authority for what we believe or what we do. I don't believe that man's mind is the final authority, but I do believe that man's mind is a tool given by the final authority to be exercised subject to his authority. So please don't think that I'm undermining what I think is the biblical character of the Christian life, that we live by faith. We live based on what God says. But you see, when God speaks to us, we can't understand Him unless we use our minds, right? God doesn't want us to turn off our minds and just start, having our emotions hum along. God wants us to use our minds in subordination to what He says. He gave us our minds and our intellect as a tool to serve Him and to glorify Him. And so I'm affirming reason today. Last night I said Christianity is the only religion that is apologetical, the only religion that affirms a rational defense of what we believe. So I'm affirming reason, but I am not affirming rationalism. In fact, and this is the key point, I'm saying that reason is unreasonable unless Christian faith is the foundation for it. All reasoning rests upon some kind of authority. All reason rests upon some kind of worldview and presupposition. All reason rests upon some kind of faith. And the faith of the atheist is unreasonable. Now, I didn't come to talk about evolution today, but to illustrate my point, when I debate evolution or give lectures on it, after I've explained the many difficulties, both scientific and philosophical, with the theory of evolution, I usually end my lecture, my point, by saying, see, that's the problem with evolution. It takes too much faith to believe it. And it really does. Have you ever thought about that? Without disputing the details of the evolutionary story, and there are plenty of details to dispute. I mean, it's really silly, some of the things evolutionists tell us about the origin of the eye and all that kind of thing, and how mutations take place and get ingrained in the genetic pool because of the advantageous, advance that they offer. Yeah, I'd like to know, what is the advantage of a partially developed lung or a partially developed heart? And yet we're supposed to believe gradually, step by step, these organs developed, and independently. Isn't that amazing? What good would it do if you had a heart that developed over thousands of years and you didn't have lungs to go with it? And so the details could easily be disputed. I mean, it's a silly, childish notion, evolution. I know you haven't heard that, and hopefully it's refreshing to realize there are some people who have studied the issue who tell you this is nonsense. But forget all the scientific detail. Let's just stand back and look at the whole philosophical picture. What is the story that's being told here? Well, we're told that at one time there was nothing, and then there was something. Excuse me, as Columbo says, I just have one more question here. You mean something came from nothing? Well, you got to grant the evolutionist a little bit of room to work, so okay, we'll give him that arbitrary assumption. Contradictory though it may be. Now, the thing that exists, what should we call it? Let's call it matter, okay? And it's undifferentiated and therefore altogether the same. And for some reason, what is altogether the same starts to differentiate. Wait a minute. So sameness becomes difference. First you have nothing, then you have something, then you have sameness, then you have difference. Well, let's give them a little more room here, okay? Let's just grant that contradiction's got to be granted as well, okay? And at one point you have matter that's differentiated, but it's not alive. And then at another point you have matter that is alive. So life comes from non-life. Wow. And intelligence comes from non-intelligence. And ethics comes from non-ethics. And self-consciousness comes from non-consciousness. And you know, once you put it all together, you see what I'm getting at? That's my problem. I can't be an evolutionist because I'm just too committed to reason. It takes too much faith to believe this. And that's the problem with atheism in general. Atheism rests upon a faith, but it's a faith that is just too much. It actually undermines man's reasoning. It's a faith that destroys what we call rationality and the use of our intellect. All reasoning rests upon some kind of faith, and my argument this morning is going to be that the atheistic faith destroys reasoning itself. Now I'm going to give you, I haven't done a lot of this in our seminar because I don't want you to be intimidated or run away from this stuff, but I'm going to give you a big word. Okay, it's going to sound philosophical and academic, and it's not something that's part of your normal vocabulary, but hey, something's got to be worthwhile for you to come. You got to leave here with something new. So here's a new word for you. Try this on your friends and neighbors. Transcendental. I'll spell it. Transcendental. Transcendental. In the history of philosophy, there have been a number of conceptions of proof offered by men. The most popular ones, rational proof, empirical proof, pragmatic proof. Rational proof says we all begin with some kind of self-evident, clear and distinct idea, and then we logically deduce from this idea that is its own evidence truths about the nature of reality. Well, the joke about the rationalists, it's not really all that funny, but what is such a joke about them is that they all started with their alleged self-evident ideas and logically deduced conclusions, and their conclusions were utterly different from one another. How did that happen? Something's wrong here. And the empiricists, these are people who say, to believe it, you've got to see it. You know, you got to be able to trace everything that you believe to some kind of observation or sensation. The empiricists say, no, you prove things by getting out there and being able to touch and to observe and to hear and all the rest. So we don't get caught up with all this rationalist nonsense about self-evident ideas and all that. Well, but then you see the empiricists didn't agree with each other all that much either. And even worse, when empiricism is pushed, it leads to skepticism. You can't know anything at all. And we're going to see an example of that once we finally get to the proof this morning. The empiricist says, well, you know, if you're going to be honest, David Hume said, if you're going to be honest, we don't really see that we ourselves continue as self-conscious individuals moment by moment by moment. We may be a self-conscious individual this moment and that moment and the next moment, but we never see any connection between those. Hume said, we don't know there's any such thing as personal identity over time because we don't ever see personal identity over time. We don't see personal identity over time for us as individuals. We don't see it for the desk that we're working at or the chair that we're sitting on. And so we can't really believe that any of these things are continuing realities, that they are individual substances. If you're going to be empirical, you're going to have to buy into it ultimately. Empiricism says you can only know what you're presently sensing. And that isn't everything. It certainly isn't your identity over time, and other things will be mentioned as well. But the empiricists lead to skepticism, and so then finally people get fed up with philosophy, I think, and what they do is they say, well, then what we're going to do is use pragmatic proof. You can't satisfy the rationalist, you can't satisfy the empiricist, and so the only thing that counts, as John Dewey said, is being able to solve our problems. So if an idea works, it's true. Well, that's really renouncing philosophy rather than engaging in philosophy, because what the philosopher wants to know is, why do some ideas work and other ideas not work? Presumably because some ideas are true and others are false. And so we're right back to the traditional problems of philosophy. Pragmatism doesn't get away from them at all. Besides, the pragmatist is assuming that we all know what kind of working is the working that proves things. That is, we all know what ends or goals we should be seeking. So somebody says, well, what works for me is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And I say, okay, well then what if tomorrow when you die, you stand before a holy God and you have to give an account of your life, and he's unhappy with you and you go to hell for all eternity? Now, was that pragmatically successful? In a sense, we could be the best of pragmatists as Christians. We could say, I'll tell you, the best way to live your life is to get right with God. Kind of like the message of Proverbs. You want to live well in God's world, you better know the Maker's instructions. Wisdom shows how to get along in God's world. The pragmatist doesn't do that. And of course, the pragmatist says, well, you can't know that there's a God. And I said, that's right. So now you get it back to original philosophical questions that have to be resolved. You can't just say what works and doesn't work without knowing what the end of the working is. What are we supposed to be striving for? Well, so in the history of philosophy, you have rational proof, you have empirical proof, you have pragmatic proof. But what I want to introduce to you this morning is the notion of transcendental proof. So I give you this brand new big word that you can throw around. Actually, the word's only valuable because it helps you, summarize. It's a tag, a summary tag for a concept now that I want to introduce. The transcendental proof is a proof from the preconditions of intelligibility. That too may sound rather academic, but in a moment I think it'll be real comfortable for you. The preconditions of intelligibility. What would have to be true for our experience to be intelligible? What would have to be true for our procedures to be intelligible? What would have to be true in order for life to be meaningful? And that's what a transcendental proof is. A transcendental proof asks, what are the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience? What would have to be true in order to make sense out of our experience? And the proof of God's existence, to put it very simply, now that we've done all the, groundwork, I've got all the window dressing up there. Now if you want to look through the window, here it is. The proof of God's existence is that without God, you couldn't prove anything at all. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of the use of logic. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of the use of science. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of the use of ethics. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of self-consciousness. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of human dignity and freedom. You getting the point? If you look at the atheist worldview, you can disprove it by showing that without God, you can't make reasoning intelligible. So that when atheists engage in reasoning, they can only do so by presupposing God. Last night I told you atheists cook the books. Unbelievers are cooking the books. They'll intellectually argue one thing, but the very use of argument by the atheist or the unbeliever shows that he's resting upon a theistic framework, or he's working within a theistic framework, that he's presupposing the existence of God, all the while denying that God exists. Now, my professor of apologetics, Cornelius Van Til, used wonderful illustrations when he taught apologetics, and one of the best of all, I think most of his students always will remember this, is he said that he was on the train once in Philadelphia, and he saw a child sitting on her father's lap, and this little girl reached up and slapped her father's face. And Van Til said, isn't that exactly what the unbeliever is doing? The unbeliever is insulting God, but he could only insult God if God were supporting him. And this is not just talking about supporting his existence as an entity in the cosmos. Van Til's talking intellectually. The unbeliever must, if he's going to use reason at all, presuppose the existence of God. He's resting on the existence of God while he's reasoning. And yet what's he using his reasoning to do? To insult God, to slap his heavenly Father in the face. He's saying, you don't exist, and I'm going to reason about this and prove that you don't exist. And when I debate with atheists in various places around the country, what I always point out to them is, your very use of reasoning presupposes the God that you're trying to disprove. Your very use of reasoning proves that God exists. God is the transcendental, the precondition for the intelligibility of all human reasoning. Now, how is that so? We need to give you an illustration of this. I'll try to give you a few illustrations before we get to our break. A form of reasoning that all of us are familiar with is in philosophy known as inductive reasoning, reasoning from previous experience or reasoning from experience of things that we have had contact with to conclusions about what we have not yet experienced. All of us use past experience as a guide to future experience. That sounds so abstract. Let's get concrete about this. I call this the toothpaste proof of God's existence. This morning when you got up, you brushed your teeth. I hope this is true. When you went to the toothpaste tube, you squeezed it. You're probably half awake, but nevertheless, to whatever degree you were being rational, why did you squeeze the tube? You expected what? You expected that when you squeezed the tube, the toothpaste was going to squirt out, right? I got that? Okay. All I want to do now, Mr. Atheist, is have you give me an account of that. So simple. Just using the toothpaste tube. On what rational basis did you expect the toothpaste to squirt out when you squeezed the tube? Now, the argument's going to go something like this. Well, many times in the past, in fact, virtually every day of my life that I can remember, I squeezed the toothpaste tube and the toothpaste squirted out. And so, on the basis of my past experience, I expected that my future experience, it's just a few moments from now, or my present experience, if you want to put it that way, would be the same. That the past would be a guide to the future. Right? You didn't get up this morning and assume that things would really work differently than they did in the past, right? That somehow the toothbrush would go over and get the toothpaste on it by itself. And you say, oh, everything's random. This is a chance world. Maybe I'll just wait here for the toothpaste to go get the the toothbrush to go get the paste on it. No, being the rational scientific person that you are, even half awake, you said, in the past I had to squeeze the tube to get the paste out, and this morning I'm going to have to squeeze the tube to get the paste out. Now, many of you may be thinking at this point, what is wrong with this guy? How can you think that's some kind of academic proof of God's existence? Well, let me show you. Let's follow the argument. Maybe you can figure out what's missing in the argument. The argument goes like this. Many times in the past, when I squeezed the tube, the paste squirted out. The conclusion is, if I squeeze the tube now, very likely the paste will squirt out. Now that argument's missing something. You need a bridge from the past to the present or to the future, don't you? You've got to add this philosophical assumption. This premise has got to be written into the argument. The premise is, and the present will resemble the past. Very simple. We don't stop to think about it because we all take it for granted. No one questions that, unless you're in a philosophy class, I guess. But when we live our daily lives, we all assume that past experience is a guide to the present and to the future. Because, to use the mundane pedestrian expression, nature is uniform. The way things happened in the past is the way they're going to happen in the future. So you've stubbed your toe in the past, right? And you've learned your lesson. You try not to stub your toe in the present and in the future. No one says, well, you know, in the past this was very painful, but today it may be the thrill of a lifetime. No, we say, we've learned our lesson. You know, I got burned by the fire. This time I keep my hand away from the stove. The past is a guide to the future. And once you realize that, by the way, that's such a crucial premise, there would be no human language, no use of language without that. We couldn't talk unless we assumed the past was a guide to the future. Why not? Well, because it's based on past usage of a word that we choose that word now to communicate the idea that we have. If we couldn't hold to the uniformity, the linguistic uniformity between the semantic meaning of words, we couldn't use words and communicate with each other. We couldn't even talk to ourselves. Forget talking about to others. We couldn't use the same word to mean the same thing unless we held to uniformity. We couldn't brush our teeth. We wouldn't avoid stubbing our toes or burning our hands. Everybody assumes that the past is a guide to the future. And here's the problem. The atheist has no rational basis for believing that the past is a guide to the future. He has no rational basis for that. I'm not saying that he doesn't believe it. In fact, it's obvious that the atheist is operating on that assumption. But only Christians can tell you why nature is uniform. Only Christians can give an intellectual account of that, because they believe in a sovereign, almighty, trustworthy God who has said that he'll see to it that seed time and harvest follow in regular succession. God has assured us, in fact, in making the world and telling us to have dominion in this world, he's assured us that he's made the world to function in this way, that we could intellectually understand it, and therefore make predictions and live in this world successfully. So when someone asks me, why is it that you believe that scientific reasoning, all science rests upon the idea that what we've learned in the past is a guide to the present and the future, why do I believe that scientific reasoning has a rational foundation? Because I believe in God. What does the atheist have to offer as a reason? Well, let me tell you what the answer always is, and this shows a sophomoric level of philosophical instruction. But nevertheless, it is the most common answer. It's an answer that's not philosophically sound. And leading atheists, David Hume, Bertrand Russell, I'll give you other examples, but those two names alone settle the point. Leading atheists have admitted this reasoning is fallacious. But here's the way it goes. The common answer is, well, it's always been that way in the past, and therefore it's going to be that way in the future. That is, in the past, when I squeezed the toothpaste tube and the toothpaste squirted out, I assumed that today, when I squeezed the tube, the toothpaste would squirt out. So in the past, my present was like the past. Therefore, in the present, I can assume that my present or future will be like the past. Am I confusing you? Well, if you want to understand it, we can talk about past past and past presents and present presents and future futures. In the past, the present resembled the past. And therefore, in the present, because there was a past present that was like a past past, I can assume that presently it's going to be like the past. Oh, some of you are still thinking, when are we going to get to the break? You got to get this, okay? Here's the argument of the atheist. I know that the present is like the past because in the past, the present was like the past. And once you put it that way, you can see the fallacy. You're begging the question, aren't you? Because the issue is not what were things like in the past, but is the past a guide to the present? Well, in the past, maybe it was, but is it a guide to the present? That is the present present, the right now present. Maybe in the past, nature was uniform. How do you know it's uniform today? Problems of Philosophy, deals with induction and finally comes to the conclusion that unless induction is a self-evident principle, carries its own evidence in itself, then there is no rational basis for holding to induction, and yet you can't be rational without believing in induction. Well, that's my point. In one sense, we can let God's enemies, be our spokesman here. Bertrand Russell makes the point very well when he says, you can't be rational without the inductive principle, but the inductive principle doesn't seem to be rational. There seems to be no foundation for it except begging the question, assuming the very thing that you're supposed to be proving. Well, now let's go back and think about what the Bible has taught us and what we've seen so far in this seminar. Paul tells us that professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And all their reasoning became futile because they would not admit what they very well know, and that's that God exists. Isn't this a good example of that very thing? Those who wish to be scientific in our day must assume something in order to be scientific, must assume something which cannot itself be made rational or intelligible without assuming the existence of God. If God does not exist, then we don't know that nature is uniform. And if nature is not uniform, then we can't use language, we can't use science, we can't draw conclusions in the day-to-day way that we do or in the sophisticated academic way that people do in the laboratory. All reasoning that's known as scientific reasoning would be itself arbitrary because the final foundations of that reasoning are just a guess that maybe today will be like yesterday. Maybe the future is like the past, maybe it isn't. We can't know for sure. I told you unbelievers are intellectually cooking the books. Because do you know any unbeliever who honestly lives in accordance with that kind of agnostic conclusion? Do you know any unbeliever who says, well, for all I know, since this is a chance universe, there's no God who controls it, for all I know, things are going to be completely different today. So I will put my hand on the fire. I will stub my toe. I will expect the brush to go over and get the toothpaste out itself. Of course not. That's laughable. It's only in illustrations, by philosophers like Dr. Bahnsen that we even contemplate that kind of thing. We all take for granted the uniformity of nature in order to live in this world in a rational way. And yet we cannot really be rational in that assumption unless we give credit to God. And this is what Paul says. Unbelievers rely upon God, but they won't give Him thanks. Every time the unbeliever is able to make a meal for himself, he should not only thank God that there was products out there and animals and plants and vegetables and so forth that he could eat, he should give God thanks that he can use his mind to know how to make the oatmeal. But he doesn't. He doesn't thank God for the oats, and he doesn't thank God that he can reason about oatmeal. That's what Paul's telling us. And that's why they become fools. They know the truth, but they suppress it. They know God. You can't look at the world without seeing God because you can't make sense out of your observations without there being a God. So let's go back to Mr. Tabish's debate with me at the University of California, Davis. He says, so where is this God? Why doesn't God show himself? And I answered, God's showing himself in everything that you see and do. This is not an invisible friend. This is the friend you can't get rid of. This is the one who's always there. And by the way, that's the offense to the atheist. And some have been honest enough to admit it. Jean-Paul Sartre said that he could not bear the idea that there was a God who was always staring at him. And so he, to put it vividly, he said one day he collared the Holy Ghost in the basement and threw him out the window. His way of saying, I will not be shackled by this idea that you're watching me, so I reject you. It's not that unbelievers can't see God, that they can't understand that there is a God. It's that they don't want that God to be so persistent. Because, you see, they couldn't reason. They couldn't drive their cars. They couldn't balance their checkbooks. They couldn't do anything rational or scientific without ultimately assuming that God is the one who keeps this universe uniform. So do we have a reason for believing in the scientific principle? Can the scientific principle be justified as reasonable? And the answer is, if you're a Christian, If you're a believer in God, yes, but if you're not a Christian, no. Then science becomes ultimately arbitrary. Let me try to give you another illustration there. I think we have enough time. This one will be easier for you to follow, but I think probably from an academic standpoint, the inductive argument is one that will be more impressive to your unbelieving friends, because ultimately they're just stymied by this. But this is nevertheless an easy way to see the point too. Why should anybody be moral? Why should anybody be moral? Why should we live according to some ethical principles? Now, if you're not a Christian, or if you're not a theist, you believe nature is all there is, if you're a naturalist, then on the principles of naturalism, there could be no moral absolutes, could there? Because on the principles of naturalism, there could be no universal obligatory authority. There could be no right or wrong about anything. Naturalism just tells us what is. Okay? If God doesn't exist, the universe has come about, who knows how, that great leap of faith called evolution or what have you. If God doesn't exist and the universe is just chugging along, spitting out all these new kinds of life forms and destroying them and who knows why, but all these are happening, there's no right or wrong about what happens. It's just what happens. You see, we don't usually talk about the morality of, and pardon me for having to mention these things publicly, but that's the point here, is that in a civilized world, we don't think it is appropriate to talk about things like animals copulating publicly, but they do. And not only that, they eat each other in many cases. Now, if there is no God and the only thing that exists are these natural principles, then the real question is, why should human beings not copulate publicly or eat each other? Somebody were to say, oh no, that's wrong. You say, no, wait a minute. If you look at nature, it's not wrong at all. It's pretty pervasive, as a matter of fact. So why do human beings not act like animals? If you were an atheist, you would not be able to give an account of that, although attempts have been made, but they're all rather silly ones. Because in every case, whenever you try to give an account of human morality, at some point you're going to step from the description of the world to a statement about what ought to be the case. But under naturalistic principles, there is no oughtness about the world. There is no rightness or wrongness about the world. There's just what is. And how do you get from what is the case to what ought to be the case? Reasonably, you can't. And so atheists cannot account for ethics. They cannot account for morality. Let me take this a step further. Atheists can't account for rationality either. I told you I had this radio dialogue with George Smith, the atheist. And the point that he was making when he was telling me that Christians have this notion of faith that is the leap that goes beyond reason, the point he wanted to make is that everything we do should be based upon reasoning. We're under an obligation to live our lives by a rational principle. Well, of course, he set himself up, didn't he? So I said, I would say that, George. As a Christian, I believe we should be reasonable. We should use our minds and should follow a rational principle when we live. But for the life of me, I can't figure out why you would say that. Because as an atheist, you have no basis to lay a moral obligation on anybody, do you? How can George Smith tell me I'm under obligation to live my life rationally? If there is no God, I can choose to live my life hormonally if I want to. I'm just going to go on the basis of how I feel at the moment. Now, George Smith will say, yes, but if you do that, then you won't live as long, because following your emotions, you may just walk in front of a train one day and get killed. To which I could say, so? Well, but you don't want to die. I say, how do you know that? Maybe I do want to die. Or maybe I don't care if I die. Now, you can keep pushing this back and back. You get the point. An atheist can't even tell me why I need to be rational. So that's the problem with you Christians. You don't live rationally. I say, that's the problem with you, the atheists. You're arbitrary about my obligation to live rationally. Only a Christian can say you must live rationally. Only a Christian can say that we must follow what are known as norms of civilization, not copulate openly, not kill each other and eat each other and so forth. Only a Christian can explain why it is absolutely wrong to murder. Only a Christian can explain why we must be rational. Only a Christian can explain how we can be scientific. Let me give you another illustration. This too from a debate that, I'm not trying to give you a commercial here, but these are on tape and you may want to listen to them to get a further illustration or have this worked out in greater detail. But I once debated a fellow who is a leading atheist propagandist by the name of Dr. Gordon Stein. And this is at the University of California, Irvine. And what I did in this debate is I pointed out that all debate presupposes the laws of logic. It doesn't do any good to have a debate unless you have rules by which you evaluate the debate and the reasoning of the people that are debating. And so the laws of logic are assumed by those who enter into a debate. But the problem is that if you're an atheist, you can't give an account of the laws of logic. Stop and think about this. The laws of logic are not something that you can see or touch or smell. You know, you can't kick a law of logic or buy one in the store. The laws of logic don't exist in that way at all. The laws of logic are what we call abstract. All laws are abstract. They're not concrete. This podium is concrete. You can touch it. It's individual. It's specific. But the idea of a podium is not. No one has ever touched the idea of a podium. Okay? So you may believe that podiums exist, but now do you also believe that the idea of a podium exists? Well, laws are like ideas in that sense. They're abstract. They're not concrete. They're not particular. You say, okay, where's all this leading? Well, here's the point. If you're an atheist, then you believe the only thing that exists is matter. The only thing that exists is concrete and particular. But the laws of logic are not concrete and particular. They are abstract, and they are universal, and they are obligatory and absolute. But matter is not universal. It's not obligatory. It's not abstract. It's not anything like the laws of logic. And so on the one hand, the atheist is committed that only matter is real, but when he argues about it, if he's going to be logical, he has to assume that there are things which are abstract and universal and absolute. And so I pointed this out to Dr. Stein. I said, you've been cooking the books, to use our illustration. On the one hand, you want to argue against God. And in order to debate, to argue against God, you must assume the laws of logic. But given your worldview, what you profess, that only matter is real, there couldn't be any laws of logic. Therefore, by coming to the debate tonight, you lost. That's right. By coming to the debate, you assume that matter is not the only thing that's real, and since you're trying to prove that matter is the only thing that's real, you lost by trying to argue. This is what I was getting at earlier when I introduced the transcendental method of proving God's existence. Atheists cannot make reason reasonable. They may engage in reasoning scientifically. They may engage in reasoning when they brush their teeth and they don't stub their toes. They may engage in reasoning when they argue that there are moral absolutes. We shouldn't lie in our lab reports. We have to be honest and so forth. They may be reasonable when they talk about the dignity of man and the self-consciousness of man and the use of the laws of logic in debate. They may engage in all these things, but they can't make sense of any of it ultimately. In the end, atheists take these things for granted in an arbitrary way. When you push an atheist about how he has a foundation for his reasoning, he'll say ultimately, we don't need an answer to that question. Reality's just this way. Well, in philosophy, that's what's known as arbitrariness. It's just this way. Well, if people could answer questions by just saying, it's just this way, we wouldn't go to the university to study at all. We'd just say, it's just this way. But the whole point of getting an education is to find out why things are as they are, to get evidence for what we believe and how we live our lives. And so ultimately, the atheist destroys the university, destroys rationality, destroys everything we know as the use of man's intellect. All in the name of what? Intellectually saying God doesn't exist. And then there'll be atheists who say, well, there's no answer possible to the questions you're posing, Dr. Bahnsen. There's no way anybody could know, ultimately, why there are laws of logic, or why nature is uniform, or why there are moral absolutes. Well, when someone says there's no way to know, basically he's being a skeptic. He's saying there is no answer. Nobody can know for sure. Well, apparently you can be very sure, though, that no one knows for sure. Skepticism always eats itself. Skepticism always destroys itself. The skeptic can't be a skeptic if he's going to assert his skepticism. So this isn't going to work. In the end, the atheist, when he runs away from God, if he were really honest, would have to run away from all rationality as well. Now, if that isn't a proof of God's existence, I don't know what is. Because what we're saying is, if you're going to be rational at all, you need to be a Christian. And if you won't affirm the existence of the Christian God, then rationality becomes impossible for you. Key philosophical questions, to come to a conclusion here. Key philosophical questions are answered by atheists arbitrarily and inconsistently, in a way which cannot make sense out of ordinary human experience, ordinary human reasoning. But they try and they hide this gaping defect in their theorizing from themselves. They cook the books. They have two sets of intellectual principles they're working with. The one set, which is the knowledge of God that Romans 1 tells us all men have, the one set makes sense out of their reasoning, out of their science, out of their logic, out of their math, out of their morality, and all the rest. But they don't want to admit that's true, so they cook the books and they come up with all these fancy theories for why God can't exist and what the problem with the religion is and so forth. But they're living in two worlds, or to put it another way, they're living in two world views. They're relying on God, they're resting on God, but not giving Him thanks, not giving Him the glory and the credit that He deserves. And they pretend to be intellectually self-sufficient. They have all these arguments they can use, but the very use of argument presupposes morality, rationality, and science. And those are the very things that ultimately are arbitrary for the atheist. Let me give you a parallel. Imagine a person who comes and argues no air exists. But as this person is arguing that no air exists, he continues to breathe air. All the while he's arguing. Now, we might point this out to him. We might point out that if, as he says, no air exists, he couldn't be breathing. Now, imagine this intellectually inept response to that refutation. He might say, no, you're wrong. You're wrong that my theory implies that I could not be breathing because, in fact, I am breathing. I say, no, wait a minute. Your theory that there is no air implies that you couldn't be breathing, in which case you couldn't be arguing this point. And he goes, oh, no, I am breathing, and so my theory doesn't imply that. Well, don't you see how silly that is? He's so self-deluded that he doesn't even catch the significance that the facts belie his theory. Your arguing requires you to breathe. Your breathing requires that there be air. So your arguing that air doesn't exist is impossible. It's self-refuting. Intellectually speaking, I maintain that atheists continue to breathe. I have no doubt about that. They continue to be scientific, they continue to be rational, they continue to apply ethical principles, but the atheistic view of things, the atheistic worldview as we defined it last night, in theory would make that kind of breathing impossible. In theory would make reasoning and science and morality and human dignity and freedom impossible. In theory, atheism would render science, logic, and ethics nonsense. And atheists work very hard to hide this intellectual poverty from themselves. And they pretend, philosophically speaking, that they're not breathing God's air all the while they're arguing against God, who has given them the air to breathe. Paul put it this way in Acts 17:28. In Him we live and move and have our existence. God is the very atmosphere of our lives intellectually. God is the intellectual precondition of our rationality. God is the intellectual precondition of our scientific reasoning. God is the intellectual precondition of our moral absolutes. God is the intellectual precondition of our human dignity and freedom. Without God, we couldn't, to use the illustration, breathe at all. And so the people who argue against God continue to breathe, all the while denying that there's air to breathe. And so this is the proof of God's existence. Without God, you couldn't prove anything. Thank you.